Hey everyone, welcome to my channel from start to now. If you love uncovering hidden stories from history, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our future videos. Let's dive in. What comes to mind when you think of Spain? Sun-soaked beaches, flamenco dancers, bullfighting arenas, maybe the streets of Barcelona or Madrid. But here's the truth most people never hear. Beneath this familiar image lies a hidden history so powerful, so brutal, and so influential that it didn't just shape Spain, it reshaped Europe and the modern world itself. This is a story of empires that ruled oceans, conquests that redrew entire maps, and secrets that history books quietly skipped. Today, we're uncovering the Spain you were never taught about, a Spain that decided the fate of continents and changed human history forever. There was a time when Spain was not just another European kingdom, not just a regional power, but the center of the world's political, economic, and military gravity, a moment in history when decisions made in Spanish royal courts determined the fate of entire continents and millions of lives. When ships sailing under the Spanish flag crossed oceans that were still unknown to most of humanity, connecting distant lands into a single global system for the first time, this was the era when Spain stood at the peak of global power, a position so dominant that it is difficult to fully imagine today, because no modern nation has ever held such widespread influence in such a short span of time. Spain's rise to power did not happen overnight. And it was not an accident of history. It was the result of strategic marriages, religious unity, military innovation, and ruthless ambition. When Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile unified their kingdoms, they created the foundation of a centralized state, strong enough to project power beyond its borders. This unity gave Spain a sense of purpose and identity that other fragmented European regions lacked at the time, and it allowed the crown to mobilize resources, armies, and ideas on an unprecedented scale. With internal consolidation largely achieved, Spain turned its gaze outward beyond Europe toward opportunity, wealth, and eternal glory. The discovery of the Americas in 1492 transformed Spain from a European power into a global empire almost overnight. Vast new lands, rich with natural resources, suddenly became part of the Spanish crown's domain. Silver from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas flowed into Spain in unimaginable quantities, funding armies, building grand cathedrals, and fueling wars across Europe. For the first time in history, a single empire controlled trade routes that connected Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, creating an early version of globalization that still shapes our world today. Spanish coins were used from Manila to Mexico, and Spanish laws, language, and customs spread across the globe, embedding themselves into societies that still carry their imprint centuries later. Spain's military power was equally vast. Its armies were feared across Europe, known for their discipline, experience, and effectiveness. Spanish tercios, elite infantry units, dominated battlefields for more than a century, defeating rivals from France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Ottoman frontier. At sea, Spanish fleets transported treasure, soldiers, and supplies across oceans that had once been impassable barriers. Control of these sea routes allowed Spain to protect its empire and project power in ways no nation had ever done before. For a time, challenging Spanish authority meant challenging the world itself, but Spain's empire was not limited to sheer force. It also ruled through administration, law, and ideology. Colonial governments were established with complex bureaucracies designed to extract wealth while maintaining order. The Spanish crown imposed systems of governance that blended European traditions with local realities, creating new hybrid societies that were neither fully European nor entirely indigenous. Catholicism became a central pillar of imperial identity, used to justify conquest and unify territories under a single spiritual authority. Monasteries, churches, and missions spread alongside soldiers and settlers, reshaping belief systems and cultural landscapes across vast regions. What makes Spain's dominance truly extraordinary is how deeply it influenced the modern world in ways many people never notice. The Spanish language became one of the most widely spoken languages on Earth, binding together millions across continents. Legal systems, land ownership models, and urban planning in large parts of the world trace their roots directly back to Spanish colonial rule. Even global trade itself, the movement of goods, people, and ideas across oceans, was accelerated and normalized by Spain's empire. The world became smaller, more connected, and more complex because of Spanish ambition. At the same time, this immense power revealed the dangers of unchecked dominance. Spain believed its empire was divinely ordained, a belief that created both confidence and arrogance. Kings saw themselves as defenders of the true faith and masters of a world that existed to serve their vision. This mindset discouraged compromise, innovation, and self-reflection. While wealth poured in, the foundations of long-term stability were quietly eroding. Instead of investing in education, industry, and sustainable economic growth, much of Spain's wealth was spent on maintaining military supremacy and suppressing dissent, both at home and abroad. Spain's control of such vast territories also stretched its capabilities to the breaking point. Governing lands thousands of miles away in an age without instant communication was an enormous challenge. Rebellions, corruption, and inefficiency became common as local officials acted with near-total autonomy. The empire grew faster than Spain's ability to manage it effectively, creating cracks that rivals would eventually exploit. Other European powers observed Spain's rise closely, learning from both its successes and its failures, preparing to challenge its dominance when the moment was right. Despite these vulnerabilities, Spain's period as the world's leading superpower remains one of the most transformative eras in human history. No other nation had previously unified so much of the globe under a single political vision. No other empire had reshaped language, religion, and culture on such a massive scale in such a short time. The legacy of this period still lives in modern borders, identities, and global systems that define how nations interact today. Understanding Spain as a global superpower forces us to rethink how the modern world was built. It challenges the idea that history progresses smoothly from one dominant power to another, showing instead how fragile even the mightiest empires truly are. Spain's dominance was real, overwhelming, and world-changing, yet it was also temporary, built on foundations that could not support endless expansion. The story of Spain's empire is not just about conquest and wealth, but about ambition taken to its extreme, about how power reshapes the world while slowly consuming itself, leaving behind a legacy that is vast, complicated, and impossible to ignore long before Spain became a global empire, before its ships crossed oceans and its armies dominated Europe. The Iberian Peninsula was the home of one of the most remarkable and overlooked civilizations in human history, a civilization built not on conquest alone, but on coexistence, curiosity, and the free exchange of ideas. This period, often referred to as Al-Andalus, began in the early 8th century and lasted for several hundred years, and during this time much of present-day Spain became one of the most intellectually advanced regions on the planet. While much of medieval Europe struggled with political fragmentation and limited access to knowledge, this part of the world was experiencing a cultural and scientific flowering that would quietly lay the foundations for modern Western civilization. One of the most extraordinary aspects of medieval Spain was the way Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities lived side by side for long periods of time. This coexistence was not perfect or free from conflict, but compared to the rest of Europe during the same era, It allowed for an unusual level of tolerance and cooperation. Scholars of different faiths worked together, translating ancient texts, debating philosophy, and pushing the boundaries of science and medicine. Knowledge was seen as something to be shared and expanded, not restricted to a single group or belief system. Cities like Cordoba, Toledo, and Seville became centers of learning that drew students and thinkers from across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Cordoba, in particular, was a marvel of its time, with paved streets, public baths, advanced sanitation systems, and libraries that housed hundreds of thousands of books. At a time when many European libraries contained only a few dozen texts, scholars in Al-Andalus had access to works from ancient Greece, Rome, Persia, India, and the Islamic world. These texts covered fields such as mathematics, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, engineering, and philosophy, and they were studied, preserved, and expanded upon with remarkable dedication. The contributions made during this period continue to shape our lives in ways we rarely acknowledge. Algebra, trigonometry, and advanced arithmetic entered Europe largely through Muslim scholars in Spain. Medical practices such as surgery, anesthesia, and systematic diagnosis were refined and taught in Andalusian hospitals that functioned as true centers of education. Philosophers explored questions of reason, ethics, and the nature of existence with a depth that would later influence thinkers of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Jewish scholars also played a crucial role, acting as cultural bridges and contributing to theology, poetry, and legal thought. What made this golden age possible was not only access to knowledge, but an environment that encouraged intellectual curiosity. Rulers often supported scholars and artists regardless of religious background, understanding that innovation strengthened society as a whole. Translation movements flourished, especially in places like Toledo, where works written in Arabic were translated into Latin and then spread across Europe. Through this process, lost writings of ancient philosophers such as Aristotle and Galen re-entered European intellectual life, directly influencing universities, scientific inquiry, and philosophical debate for centuries to come. Art and architecture from this era also reveal a deep appreciation for beauty, geometry, and harmony. Structures like the Great Mosque of Cordoba and the Alhambra were not merely religious or royal buildings, but expressions of mathematical precision and artistic vision. Intricate patterns, calligraphy, and gardens reflected a world view that sought balance between the spiritual, the natural, and the human intellect. These artistic principles later influenced European architecture and design, yet their origins are often separated from their cultural context or forgotten entirely. Despite its immense importance, this period of coexistence is frequently minimized or ignored in popular historical narratives. Part of the reason lies in how history was later rewritten during the Christian reconquest of Spain. As Christian kingdoms gradually took control of Andalusian territories, the legacy of Muslim and Jewish contributions became politically inconvenient. A narrative of religious triumph replaced one of shared achievement, and centuries of intellectual collaboration were reframed as foreign occupation rather than cultural enrichment. Libraries were destroyed, scholars were expelled, and languages that once connected communities were suppressed. The forced conversions and expulsions of Jews and Muslims at the end of the 15th century marked a tragic turning point. Spain, once a center of pluralism and intellectual openness, became increasingly defined by religious uniformity and suspicion. This shift had long-term consequences. While other parts of Europe began to experience the Renaissance, Spain, despite its growing imperial power, gradually lost the vibrant intellectual diversity that had once driven its greatest achievements. The loss was not just cultural but deeply human, as generations of knowledge and creativity were uprooted or silenced. Understanding this hidden chapter of Spain's history challenges the simplistic idea that civilizations advance only through conquest or domination. It reveals that some of humanity's greatest breakthroughs emerge when different cultures interact, question each other, and learn together. The medieval Spanish experience shows that tolerance, even when imperfect, can produce extraordinary results, while fear and exclusion ultimately weaken societies over time. The legacy of this golden age still echoes today, not only in academic texts but in everyday life. The words we use, the numbers we calculate with, the medical principles we rely on, and even the architectural styles we admire carry traces of this forgotten collaboration. Yet many people are unaware that a significant portion of what we call Western knowledge passed through the hands of Muslim and Jewish scholars in medieval Spain before shaping the modern world. By revisiting this period, we gain a more honest and complete understanding of history, one that recognizes the interconnectedness of cultures rather than isolating them into competing narratives. It reminds us that progress is rarely the achievement of a single group or belief system. Instead, it is the result of dialogue, curiosity, and the courage to see value beyond boundaries. Spain's medieval golden age stands as powerful evidence that coexistence can be a source of strength, creativity, and lasting impact, offering lessons that remain just as relevant in today's divided world as they were 1,000 years ago. Spain's transformation from a European kingdom into a global empire was driven by ambition, faith, and an unshakable belief in destiny, but beneath the surface of conquest and glory lay a system of exploitation that reshaped entire continents and left scars that are still visible today. When Spanish explorers and conquistadors arrived in the Americas, they entered lands inhabited by complex and sophisticated civilizations with their own social structures, technologies, and spiritual beliefs. Yet these societies were quickly reduced in Spanish narratives to obstacles on a path toward wealth, power, and religious expansion, a mindset that justified actions of extraordinary cruelty under the banner of divine mission. The rapid collapse of indigenous empires such as the Aztecs and the Incas is often portrayed as a triumph of superior weaponry and strategy, but the reality is far more disturbing. Disease became Spain's most devastating ally. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through populations with no natural immunity, killing millions within a few decades. Entire regions were emptied of life before Spanish authority had even been firmly established. This demographic collapse made conquest easier, while simultaneously creating a labor shortage that pushed Spain towards systems of forced labor and slavery. To extract wealth from its new territories, Spain implemented exploitative systems such as the encomienda, which granted Spanish settlers control over indigenous communities in exchange for supposed protection and Christian instruction. In practice, this system functioned as legalized slavery. Indigenous people were forced to work in mines, plantations, and construction projects under brutal conditions. The silver mines of Potosi became symbols of imperial wealth, but they were built on the suffering of countless workers who endured extreme altitude, toxic mercury exposure, and relentless labor until death. The riches sent back to Spain represented not prosperity earned, but lives consumed. Religion played a central role in legitimizing this exploitation. Conversion to Christianity was presented as both a moral obligation and a justification for domination. Indigenous belief systems were condemned as pagan or satanic, giving spiritual cover to violence and cultural destruction. Churches were built atop destroyed temples, and sacred traditions were banned or violently suppressed. While some missionaries genuinely sought to protect indigenous communities, the broader system prioritized obedience and assimilation over understanding or coexistence. Faith, which could have been a bridge between cultures, was instead weaponized as an instrument of control. Spain's empire was also sustained by a rigid racial hierarchy that placed Europeans at the top and indigenous and African peoples at the bottom. As native populations declined, enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to replace lost labor, expanding the human cost of empire even further. These racial divisions became institutionalized through laws and customs that determined social status, legal rights, and economic opportunity. The effects of this system did not disappear with the end of colonial rule, but became deeply embedded in the social fabric of former colonies, shaping inequality for generations. Despite the unimaginable wealth extracted from the Americas, Spain's economic foundation remained dangerously fragile. Gold and silver created the illusion of endless prosperity, but they also fueled inflation and discouraged productive investment at home. Manufacturing, agriculture, and innovation were neglected in favor of importing goods paid for with colonial wealth. This made Spain dependent on external production and vulnerable to economic shocks. The empire appeared powerful on the surface, but its core was hollow, sustained by exploitation rather than sustainable growth. The moral contradictions of Spain's imperial project were not entirely ignored, even at the time. Figures such as Bartolomé de las Casas openly criticized the treatment of indigenous peoples, arguing that conquest and forced conversion violated Christian principles. Debates were held in Spain about the humanity and rights of native populations, revealing an awareness of injustice that complicates the simplistic image of a uniformly cruel empire. Yet these debates rarely translated into meaningful reform, as economic interests and imperial ambition consistently outweighed ethical concerns. As centuries passed, resentment towards Spanish rule grew within the colonies. The exploitation of land and labor enriched a small elite while leaving the majority impoverished and powerless. Cultural suppression erased histories and identities, but memory endured through oral traditions and resistance movements. When independence movements eventually emerged across Latin America, they were fueled not only by Enlightenment ideals, but by centuries of accumulated suffering and inequality rooted in the colonial system Spain had built. Understanding this aspect of Spain's hidden history requires moving beyond glorified tales of exploration and conquest to confront the human cost of empire. It forces us to recognize that the foundations of modern global wealth were often laid through violence and coercion, and that progress for some came at immense expense to others. Spain's imperial legacy is therefore not simply one of discovery and expansion, but of profound contradiction, where faith was used to justify brutality, and riches were accumulated through systems that destroyed lives and cultures. This legacy continues to influence the modern world. Social inequality, racial divisions, and economic dependency in many former Spanish colonies can be traced back to the structures imposed during the colonial period. At the same time, the blending of cultures created new identities, languages, and traditions that define these societies today, showing how resilience can emerge even from oppression. Spain's empire left behind a complex inheritance, one that cannot be understood through pride or condemnation alone, but must be examined with honesty and empathy, acknowledging both the scale of achievement and the depth of suffering that made it possible at the height of its power. Spain appeared unstoppable, overflowing with wealth, territory, and religious confidence. Yet beneath the surface of imperial dominance lay deep structural weaknesses that would eventually pull the entire system apart. The very riches that made Spain the most powerful empire in the world also became a trap, creating an economy dependent on easy wealth rather than productive strength. Gold and silver from the Americas flooded Spanish markets, giving the illusion of prosperity while quietly eroding economic stability. Prices soared across the kingdom, wages failed to keep up, and inflation weakened ordinary citizens even as royal treasuries filled. A classic example of how sudden wealth can undermine long-term economic health. Instead of investing in industry, innovation, and infrastructure, much of Spain's imperial wealth was spent on maintaining constant warfare. Spain fought across Europe to defend its status as the champion of Catholicism and imperial authority, engaging in costly conflicts in the Netherlands, Italy, France, and against the Ottoman Empire. These wars drained resources at an alarming rate, forcing the crown to borrow heavily from foreign bankers. Multiple state bankruptcies followed, exposing the fragility of an empire that appeared wealthy but was deeply indebted. Spain's reliance on borrowed money signaled that its power was sustained more by reputation than by economic resilience. Social rigidity further weakened the empire from within. Spanish society became obsessed with honor, lineage, and purity of blood, values that elevated appearance over productivity. Manual labor and commerce were often viewed as inferior pursuits, leaving key sectors of the economy underdeveloped. Talented individuals were discouraged from innovation if it threatened social norms or religious conformity. This cultural resistance to change meant that while other European nations invested in science, trade, and new technologies, Spain remained bound to traditional structures that limited adaptation. Religion, once a unifying force, also became a source of stagnation. The Spanish Inquisition created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that discouraged free thought and critical inquiry. Intellectual curiosity was often seen as dangerous, especially if it challenged established doctrine. Scholars, scientists, and thinkers faced censorship or persecution, leading many to flee or remain silent. This suppression of ideas left Spain increasingly isolated from the intellectual movements transforming the rest of Europe, including the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Spain's vast empire also suffered from the practical challenges of governing distant territories. Communication across oceans was slow, uncertain, and expensive. Decisions made in Madrid often arrived too late or were poorly suited to local conditions. Corruption flourished as colonial officials exploited their distance from central authority to enrich themselves. While the empire expanded geographically, its ability to manage and integrate these territories lagged behind. Control became reactive rather than strategic, weakening loyalty and efficiency throughout the imperial system. Militarily, Spain's reputation eventually exceeded its capabilities. The famous Spanish tercios, once the most feared infantry units in Europe, became outdated as warfare evolved. Rivals adapted faster, developing new tactics, technologies, and naval strategies. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was not just a single military failure, but a symbol of a deeper problem: overconfidence combined with resistance to change. Spain continued to rely on past glory rather than future planning, a dangerous mindset for any dominant power. As Spain struggled to maintain its empire, new powers rose by learning from its mistakes. Nations such as England and the Netherlands invested heavily in trade, manufacturing, and naval innovation. They built flexible economies capable of supporting long-term growth and global competition. Spain, by contrast, remained tied to a colonial model that extracted wealth without building sustainable foundations. As colonies became less profitable and more resistant, the empire faced increasing instability. Internal divisions further accelerated Spain's decline. Regional tensions, administrative inefficiency, and economic inequality weakened cohesion within the kingdom itself. The Crown's inability to reform institutions or address systemic problems created frustration among both elites and common people. The empire had grown too large, too rigid, and too centralized to respond effectively to changing realities. What had once been a source of strength became a liability. Spain's decline illustrates a powerful lesson about the nature of power. Dominance achieved through conquest and exploitation is inherently fragile if it is not supported by adaptability, innovation, and inclusion. Wealth alone cannot sustain an empire, and fear cannot substitute for unity. Spain's leaders believed their position was guaranteed by divine favor and historical destiny, but history does not reward complacency. Empires endure only as long as they evolve. The fall of Spain from global supremacy was not sudden or dramatic, but slow and cumulative, marked by missed opportunities, poor decisions, and an inability to recognize its own weaknesses. Yet this decline does not erase the significance of Spain's earlier achievements. Instead, it offers a cautionary tale, showing how the same forces that create empires can also destroy them when left unchecked. Spain's story reminds us that true strength lies not in how much power is possessed, but in how wisely it is used, and how willing a society is to learn, adapt, and change before decline becomes inevitable. Spain's modern identity cannot be understood without confronting the deep psychological and social wounds left by centuries of internal conflict, repression, and unresolved memory, wounds that did not heal simply because wars ended or governments changed. Long after Spain's global empire faded, the nation turned inward, struggling to define who it was without the power and prestige that once united it. This struggle intensified in the 19th and early 20th centuries as political instability, economic hardship, and ideological divisions pushed Spanish society toward a breaking point that would erupt with devastating consequences. The Spanish Civil War was not merely a clash between political factions, but a deeply personal and emotional rupture that tore families, communities, and entire regions apart. Republicans and nationalists did not fight as distant enemies, but as neighbors, friends, and even relatives. Ideologies became identities, and disagreement became a reason for violence. This conflict shattered any remaining illusion of national unity and left behind a landscape of trauma that extended far beyond the battlefield. Executions, disappearances, and mass graves became grim symbols of a society at war with itself. When the war ended and Francisco Franco emerged as dictator, Spain entered a long period of enforced silence. Franco's regime imposed strict censorship, controlled education, and reshaped public memory to favor a single narrative of victory and order. Those who had lost the war were not simply defeated, they were erased from official history. Families were discouraged or even forbidden from speaking about loved ones who had been imprisoned, executed, or disappeared. Fear became a daily reality, and silence became a survival strategy passed down through generations. This culture of silence left a powerful imprint on Spanish society. Trauma was not openly addressed but absorbed into family histories, shaping attitudes, behaviors, and relationships. Children grew up sensing unspoken pain, learning which questions should never be asked and which memories should never be mentioned. The absence of open dialogue prevented collective healing, allowing wounds to remain open beneath the surface. Even after Franco's death and the transition to democracy, many Spaniards chose to avoid revisiting the past, believing that forgetting was necessary to move forward. The decision to prioritize stability over accountability during Spain's democratic transition created a fragile peace built on compromise. Amnesty laws protected those responsible for repression, ensuring a smooth political shift, but denying justice to victims and their families. Mass graves remained unmarked, stories remained untold, and responsibility remained ambiguous. This unresolved past continued to influence Spain's political and cultural life, resurfacing in debates over historical memory, regional identity, and national values. Spain's struggle with memory is also deeply connected to its regional diversity. Historical grievances, linguistic differences, and cultural identities were often suppressed under authoritarian rule in the name of unity. Regions such as Catalonia and the Basque Country carry their own historical memories of repression, resistance, and marginalization. These experiences shape contemporary political movements and demands for autonomy, revealing how the legacy of silence and control continues to affect national cohesion. The psychological impact of Spain's past extends beyond politics into everyday life. Trust in institutions, attitudes toward authority, and perceptions of justice are all influenced by historical experience. Generations raised in fear may be cautious, skeptical, or hesitant to challenge power, even in a democratic society. At the same time, younger generations increasingly demand transparency, recognition, and truth, creating a tension between those who prefer quiet reconciliation and those who seek open confrontation with history. Spain's unresolved history also influences how the nation presents itself to the world. Tourism often highlights beauty, culture, and celebration, while darker chapters are softened or simplified. This selective memory is not unique to Spain, but it reflects a broader discomfort with confronting painful truths. Yet acknowledging past suffering does not weaken a nation. It strengthens it by allowing honest reflection and growth. The act of remembering is not about assigning blame, but about recognizing humanity and restoring dignity to those who were silenced. Efforts to recover historical memory, such as the excavation of mass graves and the documentation of survivor testimonies, represent a turning point. These acts challenge decades of imposed silence and invite society to listen to voices long ignored. They reveal the scale of injustice and the depth of suffering, while also highlighting resilience and endurance. Facing this history requires courage, as it means accepting that progress and prosperity were built alongside pain and exclusion. Spain's hidden history teaches a universal lesson about the cost of unresolved trauma. When societies choose silence over truth, they postpone healing rather than achieve it. Fear may maintain order for a time, but it leaves lasting scars that shape future generations. Spain's ongoing conversation about memory, justice, and identity reflects a broader human struggle to balance the desire for peace with the need for honesty. By confronting its past, Spain has an opportunity to transform pain into understanding and division into dialogue. This process is difficult and incomplete, but it represents a movement toward a more inclusive and truthful national story. Spain's identity today is not defined solely by empire or oppression, but by its willingness to question itself, listen to forgotten voices, and rebuild a sense of community rooted in awareness,